and the stillness of a candlelit chamber, nestled within the thick stone walls of a medieval castle. The world outside felt distant, almost forgotten. The wind whispered softly through the arrow slits, and the fire crackled low, casting trembling shadows across the tapestries that told tales of saints and sinners. Here, in the quiet, our journey begins, not with scandal or spectacle, but with the simple curiosity of how people truly lived and loved. Medieval times. The phrase itself conjures a cascade of images: knights in shining armor, fair maidens in flowing gowns, and towering fortresses perched high on hilltops. But behind the pageantry, behind the armor and the myths, was a world of raw humanity. People who hungered, laughed, mourned, and desired. And within that world, intimacy, like everything else, was shaped by custom, faith, fear, and necessity. To understand what intimacy meant in the Middle Ages, we must first understand the world in which it existed. Life in medieval Europe was dictated by a rigid social hierarchy. At the top stood kings and nobles, and below them, layers of lesser lords, knights, merchants, peasants, and serfs. One's position in this hierarchy often determined not only how one lived, but how one loved, and with whom. In the countryside, most people lived in simple, one-room cottages. Privacy was scarce, and families, sometimes with multiple generations, slept, worked, and ate in the same small space. A married couple might share a straw-stuffed mattress with their children nearby. In such cramped quarters, modesty took on a different meaning. Intimacy, when it happened, was a quiet, almost hidden act, performed under the hush of night, or behind a simple curtain if one could afford it. Meanwhile, in the castles and manor houses of the wealthy, chambers provided slightly more privacy, but even then, complete solitude was rare. Servants came and went. Walls were thin. Gossip travelled faster than plague rats. Yet within these stone enclaves, rituals around courtship and desire were often wrapped in layers of symbolism and control. Religion also played a powerful role. The church's influence was immense, shaping not only how people thought about their bodies, but how they used them. Pleasure was suspect. Lust was a sin. And yet desire was not something that could be legislated away by sermons or scripture. People still found each other in meadows, in shadows, under moonlight, or within hurried vows of marriage whispered over clasped hands. Marriage itself was rarely about love in the way we imagine it today. For nobles, it was a contract, a political or economic alliance. For peasants, it was often a matter of survival and shared labor. But that didn't mean affection didn't grow. In many cases, companionship and even tenderness blossomed over time. There were love letters, awkward confessions, and secret touches. There were songs composed for distant sweethearts, and herbs brewed into love potions by hopeful hearts. The medieval world was full of contradictions. Chastity was praised, yet brothels flourished in the shadows of cathedrals. Celibacy was preached, yet clerics themselves often kept lovers. The concept of virtue shifted depending on one's gender and status. For women especially, the burden of modesty was heavy. Their bodies were watched, judged, and controlled. Yet even within those confines, they carved out moments of agency, choosing, resisting, longing. And then there were the unspoken truths. Not all desires followed the sanctioned paths. In a world that had little vocabulary for queerness, there were still bonds formed in secret, glances held too long, hands brushed in passing. In monasteries and nunneries, friendships sometimes deepened into something more, spoken only in coded prayers or shared silences. We may never fully know the private lives of people who lived centuries ago. Diaries were rare, letters often burned. But through poems, court records, folk songs and faded art, fragments remain, whispers from the past that tell us, however differently they lived, medieval people yearned in ways not unlike our own. So tonight, as we lean closer to the fire, let us not rush. Let us move gently through their world, uncovering not just what happened between the sheets, but what stirred in the hearts behind castle walls and cottage doors. Let us ask not just what was forbidden, but what was secretly hoped for. Because the truth of medieval intimacy is not found in salacious tales or dusty edicts. It is found in the quiet moments, the stolen looks, the hush of footsteps in a hallway, the prayers whispered not for salvation, but for touch. And that is where our story truly begins. To walk in love's direction in the medieval world was not always a straight path. It was a winding road, lined with tradition, watched by neighbors, and weighed down by expectations both spoken and silent. If we listen closely, we might hear the soft echo of footsteps pacing that path. Young lovers learning to speak with glances, not words. Courtship in the Middle Ages was less a dance of spontaneity and more a performance of custom. Especially among the nobility, love was expected to be composed like a piece of music, structured, orchestrated, and performed before an audience. But the real emotion, raw, untamed, often slipped between the notes. Imagine a young noblewoman standing on a castle balcony. Below, a suitor waits with a lute, his song practiced, his eyes hopeful. Their match might already be arranged, approved by families eager to secure land or title. But in that fleeting moment, before duty closes in, there is room for something tender. A flutter in the chest, a smile that means more than the words sung aloud. Among the lower classes, courtship looked different. Less poetic, perhaps, but no less sincere. A boy might offer a girl a woven bracelet, or help her gather water from the stream. A girl might brush her hand along his arm just a second longer than needed. In a world of labor and scarcity, affection often bloomed in gestures of shared work. Fixing a roof together, baking bread, tending animals. Love was not always declared, but it was shown. Yet no matter the class, courting came with boundaries. A woman's virtue was her family's honor. A man's intentions were scrutinized. Community eyes were everywhere, watching, whispering. Even the smallest village could feel like a stage, where every flirtation was weighed for consequence. To protect, reputations, traditions of chaperoned meetings emerged. Lovers might speak through intermediaries, or meet during festivals under the guise of dance. The May Day celebrations, for example, offered rare freedom, music, masks, the scent of spring in the air. Under the stars, laughter and drink loosened tongues. It was a time when love could tiptoe closer to desire. But courtship was not always innocent. Power imbalances often shaped interactions, especially when wealth or social rank came into play. A lord might pursue a servant girl not with poetry, but with pressure. A merchant's son might woo a peasant daughter with promises he had no intention to keep. The lines between seduction and coercion blurred too easily, and the consequences, for women especially, could be devastating. Still, the heart wants what it wants. And even within the strict confines of medieval society, love stories unfolded. Secret letters were tucked into baskets. Lovers met at wells just before dawn. A single rose left on a doorstep might speak volumes. Some couples defied their families, risking exile for affection. Others waited for years, hoping time or fate would shift the odds in their favor. There was even an art to expressing desire without words. The language of flowers, for instance. An iris for hope, rosemary for remembrance, red carnation for longing. Clothing was another signal, a token scarf tied to a belt, a new ribbon worn only on days when someone might notice. These were quiet, acts of rebellion against a world that often treated love like a transaction. And for those who dared to speak their hearts openly, medieval poetry offered inspiration. The troubadours of southern France sang of courtly love, a stylized, often unattainable devotion where the lover worshipped his beloved from afar, pledging loyalty and suffering in her honor. These songs, though idealized, gave language to feelings that many dared not express in real life. But real love was seldom as tidy as a poem. It was messy, inconvenient, and often misunderstood. A shepherd girl might fall for a monk. A knight might secretly yearn for his squire. A widow might find comfort in a man deemed beneath her. The heart had little patience for rules, even in an age that revered them. Yet all too often, these delicate beginnings ended not in union, but in silence. Parental refusals, forced betrothals, unyielding laws. And so, many lovers became ghosts, haunting folk tales, ballads, and village gossip, their stories preserved not just for the scandal, but for the sighs they stirred. Still, even in disappointment, something sacred remained. The pursuit. The act of caring for someone enough to risk being seen. In a world that often valued obedience over emotion, to love, even briefly, even secretly, was a quiet kind of defiance. And so we return, once more, to the shadows, to the whisper in the hallway, to the slip of parchment exchanged beneath the chapel pew, to the knowing look across a crowded feast. These were the places where medieval romance lived, not just in grand gestures, but in the stolen seconds before duty stepped in. Because before there could be touch, there had to be hope. Before passion, permission. And in those slow, cautious steps toward each other, two people could find something infinitely rare. A glimpse of tenderness in a world ruled by restraint. The marriage bed, where love, duty, faith, and flesh met. In medieval Europe, this simple piece of furniture bore more weight than its wooden frame could ever suggest. It was not just a place of rest, or even of passion. It was where lineage began, where alliances were cemented, where salvation might be sought, and where generations were born beneath the watchful eyes of both church and tradition. To understand what intimacy was like within marriage in the medieval world, we must begin with its purpose. Unlike the romantic ideals we often project onto weddings today, medieval marriages, especially among the nobility, were practical. They were arrangements, political strategies, means to secure land, loyalty, or peace. Even among commoners, marriage was as much about economics as emotion. And yet, even inside these structured unions, there was space, however small, for desire, for affection, for curiosity. The wedding night was both a moment of cultural ritual and personal vulnerability. For many, it marked the first time they would be truly alone with the person chosen, by family, priest, or circumstance, to share their life. But that night was not always private, especially among the aristocracy. It was common for witnesses, sometimes family members or clergy, to ensure that the union had been physically consummated. In some cases, the bed itself was placed in a public room, surrounded by curtains, and after the couple retired, their clothes were taken away to ensure compliance. This wasn't meant to be cruel. It was legal necessity. An unconsummated marriage could be annulled, and with lands and titles at stake, proof mattered. Still, beyond the ritual, there was the human moment. Two people, often strangers, sometimes nervous, sometimes hopeful, sometimes not ready at all. And for women, the experience was particularly complex. Their knowledge of the body, especially their own, was often limited. Education about intimacy was cloaked in euphemism, passed in whispers from older women or midwives. Many entered the marriage bed with more fear than expectation. For men, especially noblemen, the situation could be just as unclear. Their notions of intimacy were often shaped by folklore, superstition, or personal experience with courtesans and brothels, realms far removed from the sanctity of marriage. Some expected submission, others sought tenderness. Many simply didn't know what to expect. But not all was awkwardness. In households where affection grew, intimacy became more than duty. It became comfort. A shared glance across a table, a soft word before sleep. Over time, many couples found rhythm, even fondness. Some grew to love each other deeply. Others, perhaps quietly, carried longing for someone else. But in between, there were moments, honest, human, and deeply ordinary. The church, ever present, in medieval life, cast a long shadow over the marriage bed. Sexual intimacy, it taught, was only permissible within marriage, and even then, primarily for procreation. Pleasure for its own sake was often framed as sinful. Monks and priests preached against excessive lust, even between husband and wife. Some theologians even wrote lists of approved positions or times for intercourse, with holy days and fasting periods strictly observed. And yet, real life often ignored theology's cold lists. Couples, especially those far from ecclesiastical centres, found their own ways to navigate desire. In villages where clergy visited only occasionally, intimacy unfolded with fewer eyes watching. People, after all, were not saints. They were warm-blooded, flawed, and full of longing. We also find hints of tenderness in the letters left behind. A knight writing to his wife while away on campaign might speak of missing the feel of her hand. A merchant might send his bride a small, intimate gift, a comb, a pair of gloves scented with rose water. These were gestures that said, in a world of harsh survival, I remember you. I want you near. In wealthier homes, the bed itself became a symbol of status and privacy. Draped in thick fabrics to keep out the cold and wandering eyes, it was a place where a couple could retreat. There, behind embroidered curtains, conversations unfolded that never reached the ears of servants. There, jokes were whispered, stories exchanged, maybe even apologies made. Among the peasantry, conditions were humbler. The marriage bed might be a straw mattress on the floor. Privacy might be found only when the children were asleep, or the fire burned low. But love, in such places, was often grounded in familiarity and shared hardship. The husband who rubbed his wife's back after a long day in the fields. The wife who waited by the door with warm stew. These were not grand gestures, but they were the heartbeat of enduring companionship. Of course, not every union was kind. Marital intimacy could also be a place of imbalance, even harm. The concept of consent, as we know it today, was not well defined. In some regions, a husband's rights to his wife's body were considered absolute. For many women, especially those trapped in unhappy or abusive marriages, the bed was a place of silence, not safety. Yet even within these darker corners of history, resilience bloomed. Women found ways to assert themselves through subtle resistance, through alliances with other women, or through the quiet power of withholding. Some sought counsel from midwives or cunning folk. Others found solace in prayer or in tending to their children. And a few, bold or desperate, walked away, risking excommunication or worse to reclaim their lives. So, what was the marriage bed? Truly, it was many things. A beginning, a burden, a battleground, a blessing. It was where love tried to take root, even in soil not always soft. Where generations began and sometimes ended. Where truth was revealed in the hush of midnight. Not just about the body, but about trust, about kindness, about how much two people were willing to meet each other halfway. And in that space, for all its uncertainty, something undeniably human persisted. A longing, not just to be touched, but to be known, to be safe, to be chosen, even after the vows were said. High upon windswept hills and deep within forested valleys, the monasteries and convents of medieval Europe stood like islands of devotion, carved from stone and silence. Behind their thick walls, time slowed. Bells marked the rhythm of prayer and labor. Voices were hushed, eyes lowered. But beneath the cloistered calm, something more ancient than any liturgy stirred. Desire. When young men and women entered religious life, they were expected to leave behind the world, and with it, the temptations of the flesh. Monks and nuns took vows of chastity, pledging their bodies to God alone. But the human heart, as it always does, often resisted neat borders. Within the most sacred spaces, quiet stories of yearning began to take shape. Some who chose the religious path were deeply devout. Others were pushed there by circumstance. A second son with no inheritance. a daughter deemed too costly to marry off. For these individuals, the monastery or convent offered safety, purpose, even education. But it also meant isolation from the ordinary rhythms of touch, affection, and companionship. Imagine a novice monk, barely 20, walking the cold corridors of a stone abbey at dawn. The world outside still dark, the halls echoing with the creak of wood and distant chants. He carries candles for morning mass, his hands steady, his breath visible in the air. But as he passes another monk, older, gentler, his eyes linger just a moment too long. In that pause, 100 rules tremble, or picture a young nun, kneeling in a candlelit chapel, her fingers clutching a worn rosary. Behind her, a sister adjusts the altar cloth, their bodies briefly brushing. It means nothing, and everything. That accidental closeness, that inhaled warmth. It lingers long after the candles burn out. Celibacy was the law, but silence was the habit. The church did not turn a blind eye to temptation within its walls. In fact, it feared it deeply. Strict rules governed the daily lives of monastics, from where they slept to how they bathed. Monks were discouraged from physical contact, even innocent embraces. Nuns were often segregated by age or rank to avoid undue closeness. Letters were censored. Visitors watched. The body was seen as a vessel of weakness, something to be mastered, not explored. And yet, the body remembered. Despite fasts and flagellations, despite cold stone floors and hours of prayer, the desire to be held, to be seen, never truly vanished. In some monasteries, relationships blossomed quietly, between two monks who shared a dormitory cell, or two nuns who worked side by side in the herb garden. Their love was not loud, nor always physical. Sometimes it was a look, a whispered word, a touch of fingers as they passed the communion wine. These relationships, though often condemned, were not always condemned by those within. In certain abbeys, older monks or abbesses quietly turned away from things they knew, understanding that affection, though unsanctioned, might be kinder than isolation. Still, discovery was always a risk. Punishments ranged from separation and penance to exile or public shaming. Even more perilous were encounters between monks and nuns, especially during joint festivals or when nearby religious houses interacted. Stories survive in ecclesiastical records of secret letters exchanged through intermediaries, of moonlit meetings at garden walls, and even of children born in secret, hidden or abandoned. But not every story ended in scandal. Some monks, racked by longing, turned to mystical devotion, channeling their desire into ecstatic visions of union with Christ. Saint Bernard of Clairvaux wrote of divine love with a passion that burned like flame. Female mystics like Hildegard von Bingen composed songs that sounded like lullabies and lamentations in one breath. Their yearning was real, even if its object was divine. The tension between sacred vow and human need often produced extraordinary expressions of art, music, and poetry. In denying their bodies, some monks and nuns found transcendence. In struggling with temptation, others found humility. And in rare cases, the heart won out, and they left the cloister, choosing love over the veil. We must not mistake their world as purely one of repression. It was also one of quiet complexity. Monastic life offered moments of deep companionship, of shared vulnerability. A monk might spend his entire life in the company of a fellow brother, their bond deepening with each passing season. A nun might care for another, through illness, grief, and old age, their love unspoken but unmistakable. And though we may never know the full stories, hidden as they are behind walls and erased letters, we can still sense their outlines. In the worn steps of cloister stones, in the faded margins of psalters where one name is underlined over and over, in the herbal remedies passed from one hand to another, not just with care, but with trust. The monastery was meant to be a place of withdrawal, a fortress against the chaos of the world, but inside, life still pulsed, hearts still beat. And in the quiet, perhaps especially in the quiet, desire did not die. It simply found new ways to breathe. So let us not imagine these men and women as frozen in time. cloaked only in piety. Let us see them also as seekers, as people who longed not only for heaven, but for closeness on earth. People who prayed, yes, but who also dreamed and sometimes dared. It begins with a glance, too long, too soft. Then a touch, brief but deliberate. In the quiet corners of the medieval world, where rules were heavy and desire was hidden, forbidden love had many names: sin, betrayal, temptation. But beneath those names, it was something far simpler. It was the ache of a heart that reached past the boundaries it was told to obey. Adultery was considered one of the gravest offences in medieval society. Not merely a personal failing, it was viewed as an affront to the social order, a husband's honour, a wife's purity, a family's lineage, all hung in the balance when desire stepped outside the bounds of marriage. And yet, it happened. Over and over, it happened. In villages, where everyone knew everyone, even the smallest slip could ripple into scandal. A woman lingering too long at a neighbour's well. A man suddenly interested in helping with firewood, not his own. Gossip, like smoke, found its way through cracks. Soon, questions rose. Then judgment. Punishments varied. In some places, adulterers were publicly humiliated, paraded through the streets, heads shaved, clothes torn. In others, they were fined, imprisoned, or even mutilated. A wife might be cast out, a husband might be challenged to a duel. And yet, even with such risk, affairs still unfolded, because the heart, despite warnings, does not always obey fear. Among the nobility, the stakes were higher, but so were the opportunities. Castles were vast. Servants turned blind eyes. Letters were smuggled in sleeves. Rooms had hidden doors. A queen might fall for her knight, a baroness for her tutor. They lived in proximity, saw each other daily, and in those stolen moments, something dangerous took root. Consider the story of Eleanor of Aquitaine, queen of 2 kingdoms and mother to kings. Though much of her life was shaped by politics and power, rumours whispered of affections outside her royal duties, affections that, if true, would have risked everything. Her legend reminds us, even the most powerful women lived within walls that could not hold their longing. But not all forbidden loves were tragic. Some affairs, though hidden, brought joy. A baker and a miller's wife meeting at dawn. A priest and a widow bound by shared grief. These were not always stories of betrayal, but of consolation. 2 souls finding solace in a harsh world. Still, the risks were real. For women especially, discovery could mean ruin. A child born out of wedlock was marked as bastard, denied inheritance, shunned. The mother might be accused of witchcraft or seduction. She might be locked away in a nunnery, not for salvation, but as punishment. And yet, people found ways. Lovers used codes, symbols, and shared routines to avoid detection. A red thread tied to a tree, a candle left in a certain window, a line in a song sung too loudly. These became maps of hidden affection, charted carefully, followed faithfully. What's striking is how deeply literature and music of the time mirrored these hidden lives. Ballads told of doomed lovers, poems wept for sweethearts lost. Even religious texts sometimes contained verses so tender they read like love letters. The Song of Songs, read aloud in churches, spoke of lips like lilies, of bodies longed for, of kisses like wine. This interplay between sacred and sensual echoed in the lives of real people. A monk who fell in love with a merchant's daughter might frame his desire as divine longing. A married woman might pray for forgiveness even as she arranged another meeting. These were not contradictions. They were survival strategies in a world where love was policed. We must also consider the emotional texture of these secret bonds. Guilt, thrill, fear, hope. Lovers met not just in the flesh, but in the intensity of the hidden. A touch felt deeper when it was stolen. A kiss remembered longer when it was the only one. And in the spaces between longing and danger, something deeply human emerged. The hunger to be chosen, not assigned. But not every affair was romantic. Some were rooted in imbalance, power taken, not shared. A lord demanding favors from a servant, a merchant coercing a married woman with debts. In such cases, the language of affair fails. These were violations, not choices, and the lines between them were often blurred by those in control. Even so, within these dark corners, stories of resistance arose. Women banded together to protect each other. Men refused to betray their neighbors. Lovers fled across borders, reinvented themselves, started anew. The medieval world was harsh, but it was not without courage. And when we sift through the ruins of these stories, through court records, confessions, songs, we do not find monsters or saints. We find people, torn, tempted, hopeful. People who, despite everything, reached for love in the most impossible places. So the next time we picture a stone tower or a village green, let us also imagine the invisible threads that passed between windows, the hands that brushed against each other behind closed shutters, the hearts that, against all odds, still dared to feel. Because even in a world ruled by rules, love found cracks. And in those cracks, something beautiful and forbidden bloomed. In candle-lit chambers filled with the scent of herbs and the rustle of linen, the medieval body was not just a vessel, it was a mystery to be deciphered. Doctors peered into the unknown with tools forged from scripture, folklore, and fragile science. Midwives cradled the secrets of birth in calloused hands, and folk healers murmured over poultices, believing the stars and humours whispered truths about the flesh. To understand sex in the medieval world, we must also understand how they understood the body, what it meant, how it worked, what it needed, and what it feared. The dominant medical theory of the Middle Ages was based on the teachings of ancient Greek physicians, especially Galen and Hippocrates, filtered through centuries of Christian interpretation. According to this worldview, the human body was governed by 4 humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Balance between these elements ensured health. Imbalance caused disease and even moral weakness. Sexuality, too, was tied to these fluids. Lust was believed to arise from an excess of blood or heat in the body. A hot temperament might lead one to sin, while a cold or dry nature might be more virtuous. Women, according to Galenic thought, were seen as colder and moister by nature, passive, receptive. Men, warmer and drier, active, initiators. These ideas shaped everything from gender roles to marital expectations. But this framework, however flawed, offered one strange form of equality. It assumed that both men and women had to reach climax for conception to occur. This belief, called the two-seed theory, meant that women's pleasure was not only acknowledged, but considered necessary for pregnancy. A curious reversal of modern assumptions. Doctors of the time studied reproduction through second-hand texts, speculation, and limited dissections, usually of animals or criminals. Anatomy was mysterious and sacred, often misunderstood. The womb, for instance, was imagined as a multi-chambered vessel, with different compartments said to produce children of different sexes. Some believed a child's temperament could be altered by the parent's mood or the direction they faced during intercourse. Into this maze stepped the midwife. Unlike university-trained male physicians, midwives learned through apprenticeship, experience, and inherited wisdom. They guided women through pregnancy, delivery, and often the quieter, secret moments of marital confusion. When a young bride feared her inability to please her husband, it was often a midwife she turned to. When a wife whispered of painful nights or of not conceiving, it was the midwife who offered herbs, prayers, or quiet reassurance. Their knowledge was hands-on, deeply intuitive, and often more accurate than the dusty scrolls of doctors. But midwives lived in a dangerous liminal, space. They were trusted until they weren't. A healing gone wrong, a baby born ill, or a woman who claimed relief from unwanted pregnancy, and suddenly the midwife could become a witch in the eyes of the church. Reproductive health in the Middle Ages was wrapped in taboo. Contraception, though practiced, was condemned by the church. Still, records show a surprising variety of methods. Herbal mixtures, pessaries, animal bladders used as primitive condoms. Women shared these secrets quietly, passing recipes, among friends hiding ingredients in kitchen jars. Abortion, too, was a murky realm. Before quickening, the moment a woman felt the baby move, termination was often treated more as a spiritual concern than a legal one. Remedies to restore the monthly flow were known, whispered about, sometimes feared. Whether used for relief or desperation, they remind us that medieval women sought control over their bodies even within oppressive systems. Men's health, too, was a subject of concern, especially virility. A husband unable to perform his marital duty could be publicly shamed, even have his marriage annulled. Remedies for impotence were varied and often bizarre. Ground stag antler, crushed pearls, or potions made from roasted animal organs. Some relied on astrology, claiming a man's passion rose and fell with Venus's position. Sexual dysfunction, infertility, and even nocturnal emissions were interpreted through a blend of medicine and morality. Was it a physical illness? A punishment from God? A sign of secret sin? The answers shifted depending on who was asked, and whether they stood in a cathedral or a barn. At the edge of this medical world stood the cunning folk, rural healers, charm makers, and herbalists. Often women, sometimes men, they treated, not just the body, but the soul. They were called upon for love potions, fertility charms, and healing after difficult births. Their methods blended prayer, plant lore, and superstition. A tonic to inflame desire, a tea to ease shame, a whisper over a fevered brow. To modern eyes, many of their practices seem strange. But for those who had nowhere else to turn, no money, for doctors, no comfort in church sermons, these healers were lifelines. They offered not just medicine, but empathy. Even within monasteries, knowledge of the body persisted. Monks copied ancient medical texts. Some tended to the sick in infirmaries, mixing salves and recording symptoms. Others observed the effects of celibacy, writing down their own struggles, framing desire as a kind of illness to be managed through fasting or penance. And so, through all these layers, scholar, midwife, priest, healer, the medieval world tried to understand what it meant to have a body that longed, that bled, that burned with fever or with need. It was a puzzle both sacred and profane. In this world, sex was not just action, it was consequence, a source of life, yes, but also of risk and shame and power. And while the tools of understanding were often blunt, the questions were enduring. What makes us feel pleasure? What draws us toward each other? What heals us when we are broken? What does the body remember, even when the mind tries to forget? The answers, whispered over herbal brews, or etched in the margins of forgotten books, tell us this. Even when knowledge was flawed, the longing to understand the human body and the human heart was never far behind. In a quiet forest clearing, a young woman kneels beside a patch of thyme and marjoram. She plucks each sprig with care, muttering a rhyme passed down from her grandmother. She wraps them in linen, ties the bundle with red thread, and places it beneath her pillow that night. She hopes that when she dreams, she will see the face of the one who truly loves her. This was not superstition. This was yearning, distilled into ritual. Medieval people lived close to the rhythms of the land, the moon, the seasons. And just as they believed in blessings and curses, they believed in the power of intention, the quiet magic of want. Nowhere was this more potent than in the realm of love and desire. Love spells were not the domain of wizards in towers, but of village women, cunning men, midwives, and wandering peddlers. These charms and rituals were woven into the daily fabric of life, often practiced in secret, sometimes half believed, but always hoped upon. Some were sweetly innocent, placing rosemary beneath the bed to attract a faithful lover, carving a beloved's name into an apple and burying it beneath their doorway, drinking water from a cup passed by a crush, believing it would plant love in the heart. Others carried sharper edges, binding spells to prevent a lover from straying. Potions made of dangerous herbs, belladonna, henbane, believed to stir desire or devotion. Hair clippings, nail trimmings, drops of blood, all used in rituals to create invisible ties between bodies and souls. In the market squares, charms were sold openly. A ribbon blessed on St. Agnes's feast day, said to bring dreams of future spouses. A figurine carved from bone, meant to attract attention. Bottled waters, from the spring of Venus, claimed to awaken passion. Some merchants even claimed to have fragments of saints' relics, misused, ironically, in the hope of provoking very earthly results. Behind much of this folk magic lay a desperate desire for control. In a world where love was rarely a matter of choice, where marriages were arranged and women had little say in their future, magic offered a sliver of agency. To light a candle at midnight and say a lover's name was to reclaim a tiny corner of the soul. For women especially, these rituals were both expression and resistance. They used herbs not only to call forth affection, but to protect against abuse or pregnancy. They whispered prayers into river water and washed their faces with it. They wore amulets sewn into their bodices, or rubbed oil infused with yarrow on their inner wrists. Men, too, turned to magic. Young bachelors asked for spells to win the hearts of reluctant girls. Jealous husbands sought charms to keep rivals away. Soldiers wore love tokens into battle, locks of hair braided into cord, hidden beneath armor. These talismans were reminders of home, but also shields against loneliness. The church condemned these practices, of course. Love magic was seen as tampering with God's will, a path to sin. Many women accused of witchcraft had only ever mixed herbs for heartache. Inquisitors were trained to detect maleficium, evil magic, including spells meant to seduce or ensnare. Yet even among clergy, these rituals were hard to erase. Some monks copied old pagan texts out of curiosity. Others heard confessions that hinted at longing no sermon could quiet. Some folk charms blurred the line between prayer and spell. A girl might write the Ave Maria backwards, believing it would make a boy notice her. A widow might leave offerings at a crossroads, half for the saints, half for spirits unnamed. Faith and folklore intertwined, not always in contradiction, but in quiet negotiation. And then there were the songs. Folk ballads carried stories of love potions and magical tests. A girl gives a knight a drink, and he dreams of her every night. A farmer's daughter plants a rose that only blooms when her beloved is near. These tales passed from voice to voice, across meadows and markets, planting ideas in listening hearts. Some spells were surprisingly poetic. In one 14th century charm, a woman is told to bake bread while naked, thinking only of the man she desires. He will eat the bread, and his heart shall burn as the fire that baked it. Another advised men to sprinkle crushed lavender on a lover's pillow, so she may think of thee when slumber falls. Of course, not every spell worked, and not every lover stayed, but the act itself, the gathering of herbs, the quiet chanting, the hope placed into the wind, was a form of faith, a ritual of hope in a world that gave few guarantees. Even now, archaeologists uncover small remnants, bone pins, knotted threads, scorched papers hidden in hearths. These are not relics of witchcraft. They are the artifacts of hearts that reached beyond their grasp. And perhaps, in that reaching, there was something sacred. Not because the spells were holy, but because they revealed so much about the soul's quiet courage. To want, to try, to trust in something unseen. So the next time we think of the medieval world as cold or rigid, let us remember the love spells whispered into the wind, the secret dreams sewn into sleeves, the villagers who looked up at the stars and dared to believe that maybe, just maybe, magic could help them be loved. Because in the end, isn't that a kind of miracle? In the dim glow of a monastery cell, two young monks pass each other during the midnight office. Their hands graze, an accident perhaps, or perhaps not. Neither speaks, but their silence is full of meaning. In a world that doesn't name their longing, this is how it begins, in gestures too small to punish, too vast to forget. The medieval world, as we know it, did not have our vocabulary for queerness. There were no public identities, no rainbow flags, no legal protections. Yet that doesn't mean such love did not exist. It did. Quietly, often in hiding, always in tension with a society that feared what it could not classify. To love someone of the same sex in medieval Europe was not merely frowned upon, it could be dangerous. Church doctrine condemned sodomy as a grave sin, often punished with penance, exile, or worse. But the term itself was a catch-all, vague and inconsistent. It encompassed not only male-male intimacy, but also acts between men and women considered unnatural. The line between sin and affection was often drawn not by behavior, but by visibility. And so, many who felt differently lived in the shadows. Yet the shadows were not empty. Within them, lives unfolded, full of longing, tenderness, risk, and resilience. Among men, close emotional bonds were common. Letters between knights, monks, and scholars reveal language steeped in devotion. They called each other beloved, exchanged tokens, and pledged loyalty not only on the battlefield, but in the heart. Historians still debate whether these were romantic in nature. Perhaps not all were, but some carried the unmistakable rhythm of hidden love. Take, for example, the brother-making ceremonies found in certain church records. Though debated in meaning, some scholars believe they may have formalized deep same-sex partnerships, rituals in which two men vowed to share their lives, property, and even burial sites. Were these bonds romantic? Spiritual? Both. The ambiguity is part of their power. Among women, relationships often formed within convents, where daily life was spent in close quarters, away from the male gaze. Nuns slept beside each other, prayed, side by side, cared for each other in sickness. Some developed bonds that surpassed friendship, what one might now call romantic or even erotic. In letters and devotional poems, they speak of missing each other's touch, of tears shed in parting, of hearts bound together, more than with God. One 13th century nun wrote, "My soul clings to you as flesh does to bone." Her words were not scandalous in their time. They were read as spiritual metaphor. But beneath the metaphor lies something more, a need to be known, to be close, to be seen in fullness. And there were those who lived entirely outside gender's expectations. The story of Hildegard, a woman, in appearance, but referred to in documents with masculine pronouns. The tale of John Eleanor Reichner, arrested in 14th century London for wearing women's clothing and having relations with both men and women. During questioning, Reichner gave a testimony both candid and complex, suggesting that gender, even in medieval times, was not as fixed as we imagine. Such individuals defied the binary long before the word non-binary existed. Their lives were rarely easy. They faced suspicion, ridicule, sometimes violence, but they also carved space for themselves in brothels, in convents, in courts, in the margins of manuscripts where artists drew figures neither fully male nor female. Love between such souls often went unnoticed, protected perhaps by its invisibility. A merchant might keep a male companion for decades, calling him a partner in both trade and life. A noblewoman might share a bed with her handmaiden, their closeness dismissed as feminine sentiment. The absence of labels allowed some to slip through cracks, to live unchallenged so long as they stayed discreet. but discretion came at a price. These loves were rarely spoken aloud. There were no wedding feasts, no family blessings, no songs sung in celebration, only the quiet rituals of care. A letter hidden in a chest, a scarf kept beneath a pillow, a gravestone carved with initials that only two hearts would understand. Still, these lives mattered. They remind us that queerness is not modern. It is not an invention of cities or slogans. It has always been with us, in the temples, the taverns, the towers, in the eyes of two boys tending sheep, in the hands of two girls lighting candles at dawn, in the breath held between forbidden glances. Even the literature of the time could not fully suppress it. Medieval romances occasionally hint at bonds between knights that burn brighter than their marriages. Religious texts, while condemning certain acts, also contain psalms and prayers that read like love songs, and folk tales whispered of women who lived alone, together in the woods. Just friends, the stories say. But we can read between the lines. So how did they survive? Through silence, through subtext, through small rebellions, and through a resilience born of necessity. To love where love was not permitted required courage, not always in grand gestures, but in staying, in choosing closeness over safety, in risking exile for a single moment of truth. Their stories are not always easy to find. The records are scattered, censored, erased, but the echoes remain in poetry, in trial transcripts, in songs sung beneath breath. And in those echoes, we hear not shame, but longing, not scandal, but humanity. Let us remember them not as footnotes, but as whole lives, as lovers, healers, rebels, dreamers, people who reached for warmth in a world grown cold, who dared to see beauty where others saw only sin. Because even in the darkest corners of the medieval past, love found a way, quietly, fiercely, and forever. In the winding alleys of medieval towns, beneath flickering torches and faded banners, stood doors painted red. Behind them, laughter echoed low, perfumes lingered in the wood, and stories unfolded, stories that most polite society tried to forget. These were the houses of the night, the places where pleasure and desperation met, where coin bought company and judgment walked hand in hand with desire. Prostitution in medieval Europe was at once reviled and tolerated. Officially condemned by the church yet tacitly accepted by local governments, it existed in a strange twilight between sin and necessity. For many women, it was not a choice freely made, but it was a means to survive in a world that offered few other paths. In most towns, brothels were confined to specific districts, often outside city walls or near ports and markets. These areas were policed, taxed, and regulated. A woman could be arrested for selling herself on the street, but not if she did so inside an approved house. Some cities even required sex workers to wear special clothing, yellow hoods in England, striped shawls in parts of Italy, to mark them as different, as fallen. And yet, behind those marked garments were people, daughters, widows, mothers. Some had been orphaned, abandoned, or sold into the trade as children. Others entered it after fleeing abusive marriages or seeking a life outside the brutal labour of domestic service. In rare cases, a few chose the profession willingly for independence or the promise of coin in their own hands. Life inside the brothel varied greatly. In wealthy cities, licensed establishments might be run by a madam who protected her workers, provided food and shelter, and ensured safety, though not always fairness. In poorer towns, brothels were more dangerous, crowded and unregulated. Violence was common, disease a constant shadow. Despite this, bonds often formed between women who worked together. They watched over each other, tended to bruises, shared food and secrets. In a world that judged them harshly, they created their own codes of care. A comb passed in silence, a whispered warning, a hand on the shoulder before a long night. Clients came from every class. Merchants, soldiers, students, even clergy. Some sought pleasure, others comfort. There were men who treated the women with kindness, and those who treated them as objects. The line between these extremes could be thin. Some women saw dozens in a night. Others had regulars who returned again and again, blurring the boundary between transaction and tenderness. For many of these men, the brothel was not just a place of flesh, but of confession. They spoke of wives they did not understand, of battles fought, of fears they could name nowhere else. And for a few moments, wrapped in scent and candlelight, they let their guard down. It was not love, but it was something. Still, the stigma was relentless. Sex workers were called harlots, temptresses, devils. Sermons railed against them. Plays mocked them. Yet behind closed doors, society relied on them to absorb male desire, to protect the virtue of respectable women. They were blamed and used, scorned and sought. Ironically, some of the most detailed records of their lives come from those who sought to control them. City ordinances listing brothel hours, church confessions detailing sins of the flesh, court cases where women were fined, exiled, or worse. From these, we learn their names, their stories, their resistance. Some women sued for payment denied. Others testified against violent clients. A few even ran their own establishments, managing accounts and hiring guards. These were not passive victims, but survivors, navigating a brutal system with grit and sometimes quiet rebellion. Disease haunted the brothel. Syphilis, though not fully understood, began to spread by the late Middle Ages. Leper hospitals often took in women who had been discarded once their health declined. There were no cures, only balms and prayers. And when beauty faded, many women were left destitute, unless they had saved enough to escape or reinvent themselves as midwives, tavern owners, or peddlers of herbs. The church tried to offer alternatives. Magdalene houses took in repentant prostitutes, locking them away in convents where they sewed linens and recited psalms. For some, it was salvation. For others, another kind of prison. The choice between the brothel and the cloister was rarely simple. Yet even in this harsh world, there were glimmers of humanity. A prostitute might leave a flower at a client's door, not for money, but for memory. A dying woman might ask to be buried in a plain shroud, with no name but the one she chose for herself. In brothels, songs were sung that never reached courtly ears. Songs of longing, of laughter, of women who knew too much and said too little. And in art, they were not entirely erased. Medieval manuscripts contain marginalia, tiny, mischievous, drawings of women with uncovered hair or men slipping coins into hidden pockets. These scribbles were jokes, yes, but also recognition, proof that even those pushed to the edge of society could not be ignored. What was sex like in these houses? Sometimes tender, often hurried, always complicated. There was no script. Some nights were filled with stories, others with silence, but always the women carried with them the weight of being seen, but not truly known. And so, when we speak of the red doors of the city, let us not speak only of sin or scandal. Let us speak, too, of survival, of women who carved lives from shadows, who lit candles not for romance, but for safety, who learned to read faces the way others read books, looking for kindness, for danger, for hope. Because behind every red door, there was not just a body. There was a person, with a name, with a story, with a heart that beat, even when the world refused to hear it. In the hush of a candlelit room, a woman groans low into the straw-stuffed mattress beneath her. Around her, women bustle, midwives, neighbors, sisters. The fire burns hot, water steams in bowls, herbs hang from the rafters. Outside, snow begins to fall. Inside, a new life prepares to enter the world. It is the most ordinary miracle, and the most dangerous. In the medieval world, Sex and childbirth were inextricably linked. There was no separation between desire and consequence. Every act of intimacy, especially within marriage, carried with it the shadow of reproduction. Pleasure was not an end, but a means, a beginning of something far larger and often far more perilous. For women, childbirth was a central fact of life and death. Most women bore children. Many bore them often. It was expected, honored, demanded. A woman's virtue was proven not only in her chastity before marriage, but in her fertility afterward. A barren wife brought shame. A fruitful one secured legacy, labor, and lineage. But the path to motherhood was rarely safe. With no modern medicine, each pregnancy carried real risk. Infections, hemorrhage, breech births. Any of these could kill a woman within hours, and often did. Maternal mortality was heartbreakingly common. In some villages, women wrote farewell letters to their children before labor began, just in case. These letters, few and precious, speak not of fear, but of love. "If I do not return," one wrote, "remember that I loved you before I knew you, and more, after." Such tenderness was carved from pain. Midwives stood at the heart of this world, part healer, part priestess, part protector. They knew the signs of trouble. They whispered prayers. They pressed cool cloths to burning foreheads. They carried knives to cut cords and courage to cut flesh if need be. In their hands rested the line between life and loss. A birthing room was a place of women. Men waited outside, anxious, helpless. It was only after the child's first cry that a husband might be called in. And even then, only briefly. The work of birth, like much of medieval intimacy, unfolded in the company of those who had already walked through fire. But childbirth did not begin at labor. It began at the moment of conception, or suspected conception. Women watched their bodies closely. A missed moon cycle, a flutter in the belly, a dream of water or of birds. Signs were read as symbols. Superstition wove itself around the womb. Pregnancy, though sacred, was also isolating. Women were expected to reduce their public appearances, abstain from certain foods, avoid conflict. Emotional outbursts were seen as dangerous to the unborn. Some believed a frightening image could mark a child for life. Desire during pregnancy was a contradiction. The church frowned on pleasure, yet some midwives encouraged it, believing a woman who felt love would bear more easily. Some women, feeling freer from the threat of conception, experienced desire more openly. Others recoiled, their bodies aching, swollen, afraid. And what of the man, the husband, the father? Some felt pride, others fear, a few disinterest. In noble households, a son meant security, a daughter, diplomacy. Among the poor, any child meant another mouth to feed, but also perhaps another set of hands. Yet fatherhood did not guarantee involvement. Many men remained distant from the emotional and physical labor of birth. Their role was to provide, protect, and, eventually, discipline. The tender intimacy we now associate with fathers was rare, though not unknown. Some men wrote lullabies, some stood at cradles long after mothers slept, but these were exceptions, not expectations. Birth also shaped sexual rhythms within marriage. Postpartum recovery often lasted weeks, sometimes months. During this time, intimacy paused, by necessity or by custom. The church prescribed a churching ceremony for women, blessing them after childbirth and marking their return to communal life. Until then, they were seen as vulnerable, impure, even dangerous. This idea of impurity ran deep. Blood, especially menstrual and birthing blood, was viewed with suspicion. Women were believed to be spiritually and physically weaker during their cycles. This belief justified many restrictions: exclusion from altars, fasting during menstruation, even marital avoidance. And yet, within the home, women reclaimed some power through this knowledge of their bodies. They tracked cycles to avoid or pursue pregnancy. They brewed teas to soothe pain. They built networks of support, other mothers, aunts, sisters, sharing wisdom that no man could understand. Sometimes they sang. Songs passed from woman to woman, from labor bed to lullaby. Songs that named pain, praised endurance, or simply filled the long hours of waiting. In these melodies, we glimpse the emotional heart of childbirth, not just biology, but belonging. Still, the joy of a healthy birth did not erase its shadow. Many babies died in infancy. Cold, hunger, illness. They claimed little lives before names were learned. Baptism was rushed, sometimes within minutes of birth, to save a soul from limbo. Tiny coffins lined with linen scraps were buried quietly, often without markers. For mothers, this grief was private, persistent. They carried it in silence, or stitched it into embroidery, or whispered it into the hair of another newborn, praying this one would stay. And yet they kept loving, kept hoping, kept reaching for closeness, even knowing what it might cost. In this way, sex in the medieval world was never just about pleasure or sin. It was also about survival, about courage, about the strength to begin again after burying the last beginning. It was a cycle, lived with open eyes. A woman lay with her husband, knowing it might lead to life or death. She gave birth, knowing it might bring joy or mourning. She sang to her child, knowing it might be the only song. And somehow, still, she chose it. Let us remember her, not only for the children she bore, but for the world she carried within her. A world where every heartbeat mattered, where every embrace was a defiance against the dark. Because in a time of risk and silence, the act of loving, fully, tenderly, was not only intimate, it was brave. Beneath the stone arches of a town hall, a man stands with his head bowed. His wrists are tied, his name murmured by the gathered crowd. No blood has been spilled, no coin stolen. His crime, lying with someone he was not meant to. Desire, unapproved, has brought him here. And the law, as always, has come to collect its price. In the medieval world, the reach of the law extended far beyond theft or treason. It reached into the bedchamber, into the body, into the unspoken corners of love. Sexual behavior so deeply personal was made public through edicts, punishments, and shame. And while enforcement varied wildly across regions and eras, the message remained chillingly clear. Intimacy belonged to the church and the crown, not the individual. The church, as moral authority, set much of the tone. It declared which acts were pure and which were perverse. Marital sex, for procreation alone, was tolerated, though even that was subject to rules. No intimacy on Sundays, none during Lent, none while pregnant, menstruating, or nursing. These restrictions could stretch for months, turning desire into something that always felt slightly forbidden. Acts outside marriage were not just frowned upon, they were criminal. Adultery, fornication, homosexuality, bestiality, incest, even masturbation, all could be punished by both church and state. The severity depended on one's status. A noble might receive penance, a peasant, lashes, a priest, exile, a woman. Well, her fate often rested in the hands of men. Records from ecclesiastical courts offer a window into this harsh scrutiny. Pages upon pages describe interrogations. Did you lie with him? How many times? Under what roof? Was there coin exchanged? Witnesses? Confessions were coaxed or coerced, often with little regard for dignity. Some cases involved only whispered, gossip, neighbours accusing neighbours, fueled by envy or suspicion. Others were startlingly detailed, preserved by clerks who seemed both fascinated and judgmental. A young couple caught kissing before vows, a widow seen too often in the blacksmith's shop, a priest rumoured to visit a certain house after dark. Punishments could be public or private. A woman might be paraded through the streets with her head shaved or forced to kneel at the church door during Mass. A man might pay a fine, fast for weeks, or be banned from sacraments. More severe cases led to imprisonment or branding. and in some regions, repeat offenders were even executed. But beyond the punishment itself was the spectacle. Shame was part of the process, crafted to deter others. Bodies became cautionary tales. A scarlet letter sewn into a gown, stocks placed outside the market, whispers that followed someone long after the sentence was served. What's more, the law did not fall equally. Men, especially those with wealth or titles, often escaped serious consequence. Women bore the brunt, not only of sin, but of proof. A pregnant body could not lie. An unwed mother had no way to hide. She was the evidence. He often was the rumor. And yet, within this system, people resisted. Some lied, others fled. A few bribed officials or married quickly to escape disgrace. Villagers sometimes protected their own, refusing to testify. Mothers hid daughters during investigations. Lovers created elaborate alibis. The law watched, but it did not always win. There were, too, laws that tried to regulate brothels. Some cities allowed them under strict control, mandating hours, locations, even prices. Officials argued that legalized sex work prevented greater sins, but beneath this logic was hypocrisy. Governments taxed what the church condemned. They used women's labor, then labeled them unclean. At the same time, civil law and canon law often overlapped awkwardly. A man might be absolved by the church but fined by the town. A woman might be forgiven by her priest but shunned by her guild. The lines blurred, and within those blurs, real people stumbled. Notably, punishment wasn't always for what happened, but for who was involved. Same-sex relationships were more harshly punished when made public. Interclass liaisons, especially when a noblewoman was involved, threatened social order, and acts that challenged gender roles, like cross-dressing or female independence, drew particular ire. In this way, the regulation of sex was never just about morality. It was about control. Control over inheritance, over reputation, over the roles people were expected to play. By policing who could love whom and how, medieval society maintained its rigid hierarchy. Sexuality, in this context, became a currency of power, and punishment, a way to guard the vault. Yet for all the laws, love persisted. People still found one another, beneath windows, behind churches, in fields and forests and flickering taverns. Some married in secret, others never married at all. Letters were burned, meetings arranged with care. And in the eyes of two people who risked everything for a moment of closeness, no law could hold. These were not rebels in the modern sense. They were just human, aching for touch, for trust, for someone who saw them without judgment. So when we read the records, we must look beyond the ink, beyond the accusations and edicts. We must imagine the man who walked to court with shaking hands, the woman who held her breath as names were spoken, the priest who flinched when asked to condemn, and the clerk who, while writing down sins, wondered if he too had crossed a line once. Because the story of law in the Middle Ages is not just about rules, it's about resistance, about what it meant to be human in a world that tried to regulate even the smallest stirrings of the heart. And in that resistance, we find something deeply familiar, the quiet, stubborn truth that love does not ask permission. In the margins of a 14th century manuscript, just beside a drawing of a bishop blessing a field, something peculiar appears. A rabbit wielding a sword, chasing a dog. Turn the page, and you'll find a nun harvesting phallic-shaped plants. These were not mistakes, they were messages, playful, secretive, rebellious, because even in a world bound by rules, people found ways to speak of what they were told not to name. Desire in the medieval world often lived in metaphor. Direct discussion of sex, especially in literature or art, was risky. The church censored, the courts punished, and society looked askance. But people still longed, still laughed, still imagined. And so, they turned to symbols, apples, pears, and figs. Gardens overgrown with vines, keys slipping into locks, chalices overflowing. The language of fertility and flesh was buried inside allegory, so that the reader could understand without the writer ever confessing. Take the Roman de la Rose, one of the most widely read texts of the Middle Ages. On the surface, it is a dream, vision, a poetic journey through a walled garden of love. But between the roses and the riddles lies a clear metaphor, the pursuit of physical union, cloaked in flowers and philosophy. For medieval readers, it was not just literature. It was instruction, fantasy, and satire all at once. Courtly love poetry, too, was heavy with double meanings. A knight longing for his lady might be speaking of a noblewoman, or simply of longing itself. Lines such as, "Her glance wounds deeper than a blade," carried both romance and eroticism. The pain of desire was real, and often celebrated as noble suffering. Minstrels and troubadours took these themes to the streets. Their songs, sung in marketplaces or taverns, told of secret affairs, jealous husbands, and daring escapes. Some were bawdy, others tragic. All danced on the edge of what could be said aloud. A phrase like, "she let down her hair," might mean more than just loose tresses. In visual art, symbolism flourished. Unicorns nestled in virgin laps. Snakes coiled around fruit. Fountains flowed endlessly in sculpted stone. Even religious art was not immune. Paintings of saints often included sensual imagery, bare feet, parted lips, or expressions of rapture that mirrored earthly pleasure. This was not hypocrisy. It was complexity. For medieval people, the line between sacred and sensual was thin. Mystics wrote of divine ecstasy in terms that resembled physical climax. A nun might describe union with Christ as a consuming fire or sweet intoxication, and while theologians debated the dangers of lust, artists painted the body with reverence and awe. Marginalia, those tiny drawings in the corners of manuscripts, gave scribes and illuminators a place to play. Some depicted animals in humorous, often sexualized scenes, monkeys playing flutes between a woman's legs, snails mounting knights. Others drew caricatures of clergy caught in compromising positions. These images were rarely meant for wide audiences. They were private jokes, quiet rebellions, but they tell us something important. Even those tasked with copying holy texts needed a release. A place to say, "Yes, I feel it too. I wonder. I desire." Folk tales passed from mouth to mouth added to this tapestry. In them, millers' wives were clever, monks were often lustful, and young lovers outwitted old gatekeepers. These stories did not aim for purity. They aimed for recognition, laughter, connection. And across Europe, from Icelandic sagas to Arabic-influenced Spanish poetry, we see this pattern repeat. A culture struggling to contain what cannot be contained. The body, the craving, the need to speak, even if only in whispers. Some works were more explicit and more controversial. The Decameron by Boccaccio, written in the shadow of the Black Death, tells 10 days of stories, many of which center on erotic misadventures. Its boldness shocked some, delighted others. In England, Chaucer's Canterbury Tales included the Haika, Miller's Tale, where a randy carpenter's wife tricks both her husband and her suitor in a tale of sex and mistaken identity. These were not hidden meanings. They were plain and wildly popular, but not everyone had access to books or paintings. For the poor and the illiterate, expression came through embroidery, carvings, or oral storytelling. A wooden bedpost might include a slyly carved symbol. A tapestry might include a wink only the weaver knew to place. Desire was democratic. It found a way to speak, regardless of class. Even within monasteries, forbidden books circulated. Priests and monks copied texts with a knowing glance. Some read Ovid in secret. Others wrote poetry that blurred the lines between spiritual and sensual longing. The need to understand pleasure, its mystery, its danger, its pull, was universal. And so, what was forbidden became encoded. To love became to garden. To kiss became to hunt. To make love became to play music, to ride, to unlock, And in these metaphors, medieval people gave themselves permission, not to act, perhaps, but to imagine, and imagination was powerful. It bridged the space between prayer and poetry, between suppression and expression. It allowed people to say, "I know this feeling," without saying it out loud, and sometimes that was enough. A song hummed beneath breath, a line remembered at night, a drawing that made one smile in the margins of a dull sermon. These were the secret languages of desire. So let us not see the Middle Ages as grey and joyless. Let us see it as alive with colour, hidden, layered, coded, yes, but no less vivid. A time when people, though told to be silent, found ways to sing, because when the heart wants to speak, it always finds a way, even if it must do so in symbols. In the cool shadow of a cathedral nave, a monk lifts his voice in chant. Latin syllables echo against stone walls, rising like incense. Outside, a woman kneels before a statue of the Virgin Mary, lips moving in silent prayer. In her pocket is a folded slip of parchment. On it, a confession, not of theft, not of anger, but of desire. Because in the medieval world, desire did not end at the skin. It touched the soul, and for that, it had consequences beyond this life. To understand medieval sexuality, we must understand what it meant to sin, and what it meant to be saved. The Church taught that sexual sin was among the most dangerous. It was bodily, yes, but also spiritual. Carnal desire could lead to the fall of kingdoms, the corruption of priests, the damnation of the soul. Lust, one of the 7 deadly sins, was described not just as temptation, but as a gateway to chaos. And yet it was everywhere. From the lowliest peasant to the Pope himself, no one was immune. That tension between the inevitability of desire and the severity of punishment created a constant undercurrent of fear, guilt, and secrecy. Confession became the battleground. In dim booths, parishioners whispered their deeds to priests. I touched. I watched. I dreamt. Every word was a risk, but also a relief. The confessor, in turn, assigned penance, fasts, prayers, pilgrimages. A man who lay with a woman before marriage might be told to walk barefoot to a shrine. A woman who tempted another's husband might be ordered to donate her only cloak. Penance was meant to purify, but also to humble, and it did not always offer closure. Some feared that even forgiven sins could drag a soul into purgatory. Or worse, artists painted those fears in vivid colour. In the frescoes of chapels and on the pages of prayer books, hell was filled with naked bodies writhing in torment. Demons pierced lovers with fiery forks. Adulterers were chained together, forced to gaze at each other in eternal shame. Those who had abused their flesh were often shown surrounded by flames, mouths open in silent screams. These images were not subtle. They were warnings, but not all visions of the afterlife were so grim. Saints and mystics spoke of divine mercy, of love redeemed. Some told of visions in which former sinners were cleansed by suffering and raised into light. Mary Magdalene, once a symbol of sexual sin, became a beloved saint, proof that passion, when transformed, could lead to grace. Still, most people lived in fear of slipping. Even within marriage, sex had to be carefully timed and spiritually justified. Too much enjoyment. Sinful. Too little desire for children. Suspect. Some priests warned that spouses who took pleasure in each other risked damnation, even if they remained faithful. This fear shaped behaviours. Husbands and wives sometimes refrained from intimacy for months, especially during Lent or Advent. Newlywed couples were cautioned to pray before consummation, and if one partner showed too much enthusiasm, it might raise eyebrows in the confessional. For women, the stakes were especially high. Virginity was idealized, chastity exalted. A woman who preserved her purity was seen as spiritually superior, closer to the Virgin Mary, further from Eve. Monastic orders for women flourished, offering an escape from the dangers of sexual sin. Yet even in convents, desire did not vanish. It simply changed shape. The church's obsession with purity led to rituals of cleansing, both physical and spiritual. Holy water sprinkled on beds, hymns sung before sleep. Some believed that praying certain psalms could erase impure dreams. Others tied charms around their waists, hoping to suppress arousal. And yet, beneath all the regulation, the longing remained. People still kissed beneath trees, still carved hearts into wood, still whispered names into the dark. And many believed, despite sermons, that love, even sensual love, might have a place in heaven. This belief found its way into mystical writings. Hildegard of Bingen, a nun and visionary, wrote of divine love as a living fire that burned through the soul. Her visions pulsed with sensual language, saying that the soul's union with God could feel like sweet, overflowing warmth. Other mystics echoed this, that the ecstasy of the spirit and the ecstasy of the flesh were mirrors, not enemies. These writings did not reject desire, they transfigured it. Still, for most people, the fear lingered, not just of hell, but of judgment, by neighbors, by priests, by the divine. Every act of touch carried moral weight. Every sigh might be overheard by angels or demons. The bedroom, the confessional, the grave, all were connected. Funeral rites reflected this too. A woman known for loose behavior might be buried outside consecrated ground. A man who died with unconfessed sins might be denied a proper mass. And yet, some tombs, quietly, bore carvings of lovers' hands entwined. Proof, perhaps, that even in death, love was remembered. So what did sex mean in a world so haunted by sin? It meant vulnerability, hope, risk. It was an act of life shadowed by the fear of death, and yet also a defiance of that fear. To make love in such a world was to say, I am human, I am flawed, and I long to be touched. It was not easy, but it was honest, and maybe that's why people kept doing it, kept loving, desiring, despite the risk, because they believed somewhere, deep, that even in a world ruled by penance and punishment, love might be its own kind of salvation. The bells rang slowly, a deep and hollow sound. Along the narrow streets, carts creaked beneath the weight of the dead. Smoke rose from pyres. Shutters were nailed shut. The air smelled of ash and herbs and fear. The Black Death had come, and with it, silence. Yet even then, people still reached for each other. In the face of death, love became both desperate and defiant. The 14th century was a time of profound rupture. When the plague swept across Europe, it did not merely kill, it unstitched the very fabric of life. Whole villages vanished, families were torn apart, priests fell alongside peasants. Hope grew thin. In such a world, the desire for touch did not disappear, it intensified. Some responded with abstinence, believing the plague a punishment for sin. They turned to fasting, flagellation, and celibacy. The body was seen as a vessel of contagion, and pleasure a provocation. Entire sects marched through towns, whipping themselves in penance, hoping their suffering might turn away God's wrath. Others reacted differently. They danced, drank, embraced strangers, made love beneath the stars. If tomorrow could not be counted on, tonight became sacred. A stolen kiss, a shared bed, a whispered name in the dark. These were not just pleasures, they were protest, proof of life in a world obsessed with death. The church tried to hold the line. Sermons warned of moral collapse. Pamphlets blamed prostitutes, foreigners, women. But beneath the warnings, something had changed. People no longer feared sin the way they once had. When the grave could open without warning, the soul seemed less bound by doctrine and more by instinct. In this climate, sexual norms shifted. Marriages were made quickly. Widows remarried within days. Lovers met without permission. Brothels, despite condemnation, flourished, offering not just flesh, but comfort. Even those who had once preached restraint found themselves quietly forgiving what they had once punished. Not all of it was romantic. In times of chaos, exploitation also grew. Some used fear as leverage, others sought control in dominance. But amid the dark, there were also flickers of light. Survivors found each other. Midwives still tended births. Letters still carried the words, "I miss you." The plague was not the only crisis. Warfare, too, tore across the continent. The 100 Years' War raged between England and France. Crusades continued in the East, and in every campaign, the rhythms of intimacy changed. Soldiers far from home sought companionship, in towns, in tents, in the arms of those who might not have chosen them otherwise. Camp followers, women who travelled with armies, sometimes as cooks, laundresses, lovers, became both indispensable and invisible. They provided care and closeness, often at great personal risk. Their stories were seldom recorded, but they were the quiet glue that held fractured lives together. At home, absence reshaped relationships. Wives managed households alone. Betrothed couples wrote letters across battlefields. Children were conceived in haste before departures. Some never met their fathers. Others returned changed by what they had done, or seen, or lost. Sex in wartime was a paradox. It was an anchor and an escape. A soldier might seek it to feel human again. A villager might offer it to feel protected. And in the shattered spaces, where homes once stood, new families were sometimes formed from grief and need. Disease followed war. Syphilis spread. So did shame. Bodies bore the scars of both blade and bed. And yet, intimacy did not vanish. It adapted, learned to live with loss, to touch without promise, to love without guarantee. Art and literature began to reflect this shift. In paintings, couples held each other more closely. In songs, love became more urgent. In poems, desire was no longer coy. It was bold, raw, aware of time slipping fast. The body, once a temple of temptation, became a haven, something worth risking for. Even religion softened in places. Mystics spoke of a God who understood longing. Priests buried lovers side by side. Confession focused less on rules and more on mercy. After so much death, perhaps forgiveness became more important than judgment. Of course, not everyone welcomed change. Moralists fought to restore the old order. Laws were tightened. Women accused of promiscuity were beaten, branded, cast out. Brothels were burned. But even then, desire found new doors to knock on. You cannot bury the human need to connect. Not, even under plague pits and battlegrounds. And in some of the darkest places, the most tender moments occurred. A man holding his wife's hand as she coughed her last. A soldier writing a love poem in the margins of a battle plan. A girl slipping. A carved token into a traveller's satchel. These were not grand gestures, but they mattered. Because in times of plague and war, sex was never just sex. It was memory, resistance, hope. A reminder that the body, though frail, could still feel, still give, still be chosen. It was, in its simplest form, a way to say, I'm still here. I'm still alive. So when we think of the Middle Ages as an age of darkness, let us also remember the light that flickered between bodies. Let us remember that in the ruins of cathedrals and castles, people still loved, still kissed, still dared, because even in the face of death, desire survived, and in that survival, something beautiful endured. A young girl, not yet 12, watches her mother carefully, how she kneads dough, how she binds her hair, how she glances out the cottage window when certain men pass. No one has explained anything to her, not with words, but she's learning. Every sideways glance, every unfinished sentence, every warning cloaked as advice, weaves together a lesson about what it means to grow into a woman. In the medieval world, sex was not taught. It was absorbed. There were no formal classes, no books for teenagers, no public campaigns on health or safety. Instead, knowledge came in fragments, through overheard conversations, superstition, metaphor, and experience, sometimes welcome, often not. It was a world where the body was central to life, but cloaked in mystery, a place where children became adults without ever really understanding what that meant. Most children learned about sex not in the abstract, but in the practical realities of their environment. In small cottages where whole families shared a sleeping space, privacy was rare. A child might wake to the sounds of their parents in the dark. They might notice the way a man touched a woman's arm at market. They might hear older siblings whisper crude rhymes behind the barn. From these scraps, they pieced together understanding, often wrong, often frightening. For girls, the first blood marked a sudden and dramatic shift. Menstruation was met with both reverence and dread. Mothers might offer herbal remedies or old cloths, but rarely explanations. "Your body is changing," they'd say. "Be careful now." Of what, exactly? That was left unsaid. Boys, on the other hand, were left to their own curiosities. Wet dreams were interpreted as omens, signs of moral weakness, or even demonic influence. Priests warned them to resist temptation. But how? The body gave no instructions. Among the elite, education sometimes included vague references to marriage and duty. Noble daughters might be told to submit to their future husbands, and sons might be instructed to produce heirs. But even in castles, the details remained elusive. Girls were warned of shame. Boys were promised power. Neither was taught about tenderness. Books existed, of course, but not for everyone. Most were written in Latin, accessible only to the educated. Few. Some medical texts included anatomical diagrams, though wildly inaccurate. The female body was often depicted as a flawed, inverted version of the male. Pleasure was barely mentioned, except in the context of sin. More often, knowledge was passed through folk wisdom. Midwives explained cycles through moon phases. Herbalists spoke of fertility in terms of hot and cold humours. A dried toad worn around the neck might prevent pregnancy, they said. A tea of rue and pennyroyal might cleanse the womb. Truth was mixed with myth, and the line between the two blurred beyond recognition. And then there were the warnings. Don't sit too long under a full moon. Avoid cold water if you've been with a man. Don't eat too many figs. These admonitions made little sense to the uninitiated, but they shaped behavior. Fear filled the gaps where knowledge should have been. The church played a powerful role in keeping sexuality silent. From a young age, children were taught about sin. Lust was likened to fire. Impure thoughts were cause for confession. Touching oneself, even in sleep, required penance. The body was both temple and trap, yet human curiosity persisted. Children asked questions. Where do babies come from? Why can't I sleep in the same bed with Cousin Joan anymore? The answers varied from God, because you're older now. Often, the question itself was punished before it could be answered. In some villages, older women acted as informal educators, not officially, but through quiet mentorship. A grandmother might take a girl aside before her wedding and whisper instructions. An aunt might hand a bride a pouch of herbs to help with the first night. These were acts of care, of survival. For boys, instruction came in different ways, sometimes from older men, sometimes from prostitutes, often through bravado-filled exaggeration in stables and taverns, rarely through empathy or truth. The first sexual experience for many was confusing, painful, disappointing. Few were prepared for what it would feel like, not physically, not emotionally. The silence of their youth followed them into adulthood. Shame lingered like a second skin. Yet there were exceptions. In some monastic schools, teachers gently explained reproduction through allegory. In rare texts, like the Taquinum Sanitatis, sex was described as part of health, something to be moderated, not merely condemned. A few noble women, educated and bold, wrote letters to their daughters that included candid wisdom about marriage and pleasure, but these were rare candles in a very dark room. Even so, people found ways to understand each other. Lovers learned through trial and error. Husbands and wives grew into each other over time. What was never said became felt. A sigh, a look, a touch that said, "I don't know what I'm doing either, but I want to try." And in those moments, knowledge took root, not in words, but in care. So when we ask what sex education looked like in the Middle Ages, the answer is complicated. It was silence, wrapped in myth. It was warnings, half-truths, and the occasional gesture of kindness. It was fear, but it was also curiosity, wonder, and sometimes the bravery to ask again, because no matter how tightly a culture tries to silence the body, the heart keeps asking questions. And even the smallest answer, whispered, in trust, can echo for a lifetime. In the flickering light of a castle chamber, a woman fastens a girdle around her waist. Her maid braids her hair with red ribbon, carefully leaving a few strands loose around her face. The gown she wears is not merely for warmth or modesty, it is a message. Every fold, every color, every button is a silent signal. Tonight, she wants to be seen. For all its religious strictness and moral codes, medieval society was not blind to beauty. It admired, desired, and obsessed over it. Seduction didn't begin in the bedroom. It began at the threshold, in the marketplace, at the feast table. It began with how one looked, how one moved, and how one chose to be seen. Clothing was the first language of desire. Sumptuary laws tried to restrict who could wear what. In many regions, only nobles could wear fur-lined cloaks, certain silks, or particular colors like deep crimson or ultramarine. These laws were meant to preserve social order, but beneath the rules, people found ways to express themselves. For women, fashion was a balancing act between virtue and allure. Necklines varied with region and era, sometimes plunging daringly, other times tightened high beneath the chin. Sleeves flowed like waterfalls. Gowns clung or billowed, depending on the message one wished to send. A finely embroidered hem suggested refinement and wealth. A belt slung low on the hips hinted at youth and fertility. Hair was especially significant. Unmarried women wore it long and loose, a symbol of virginity. Married women covered theirs, with veils or wimples, though some let a few curls slip through. In courts, blonde hair was prized, and many women bleached their locks with herbs, wine, and sunlight. Fair skin, delicate hands, and a soft voice were seen as signs of beauty and breeding. For men, appearance was no less calculated. A fine tunic, belted at the waist, emphasized broad shoulders and lean hips. Tight hose revealed the shape of legs, something not lost on the poets of the time. Shoes curled at the toe, hats tilted just so. Knights polished their armor not only for battle, but for spectacle. To look desirable was to show control, health, and wealth. Grooming, though often dismissed in popular imagination, was essential. Both men and women bathed when they could. Public bathhouses were common until fears of disease and immorality led to their decline. They used oils, perfumes, and herbs. Teeth were cleaned with cloth and salt. Skin was softened with milk or rosewater. Body hair was shaped, not ignored, and in the realm of beauty, cosmetics existed, though quietly. Women tinted their cheeks with crushed berries, outlined eyes with soot or lead-based powders, and used herbs to plump lips. These efforts were sometimes condemned as vain or deceptive, but they persisted. Because beauty was not just vanity, it was power. Art and literature reinforced these ideals. In illuminated manuscripts, lovers were often shown exchanging tokens, a ribbon, a ring, a lock of hair. These objects were not merely romantic. They carried scent, texture, and memory. They were, in a way, extensions of the body, courtly love. Poetry described not only the soul of a beloved, but her form. Lips like coral, skin like alabaster, hands as slender as reeds. The male form, too, was idealized. Eyes like steel, arms like tree branches, a voice that stirred the leaves. These descriptions were not just metaphor, they were maps of longing, but standards of beauty were not universal. In some cultures within medieval Europe, plumpness was prized as a sign of prosperity. In others, thinness and pallor were fashionable, hinting at nobility's indoor life. A sun-kissed tan was a mark of labor, and therefore low status. But what all these variations shared was this: bodies mattered. More than bodies, presentation mattered. To lace a corset slowly before a feast, to choose a pendant that brushed the collarbone, to wear boots high and polished. These were not simply choices of style, they were rituals of readiness, for attention, for affection, for possibility. And with attention came rules. Too much perfume might be seen as provocative, a dress too tight, suspicious, a man too adorned, effeminate. The line between attraction and impropriety was narrow and often shifting. A noblewoman's glance might thrill or condemn. A servant's new tunic might spark rumors. Yet people dressed not only for others, but for themselves. To feel beautiful. To reclaim the body, even briefly, from the grind of duty or pain. A widow might wear a bright ribbon on the anniversary of her first kiss. A soldier might clean his boots before visiting a girl who once smiled at him. These were small acts, but sacred. Even the poor, often depicted as drab or dirty, had their moments. A peasant girl might save for months to buy a single-coloured shawl. A farmer might carve a wooden comb to give to his sweetheart. These tokens, these efforts, were not about status. They were about being seen. Because in a world so often ruled by silence and shadow, to make oneself visible, intentionally, proudly, was an act of agency. So when we look at paintings of stiff gowns and solemn faces, let us remember the truth beneath the layers, the tightened laces, the borrowed perfume, the glint in the eye that no wimple could hide. Clothing was never just about covering the body. It was about revealing something deeper, longing, pride, hope. It was the first invitation, the first question. Do you see me? And for those lucky, enough to be seen, to be noticed, remembered, chosen, beauty became not only a tool of attraction, but of affirmation. In the end, the medieval world knew what we still know, that desire often begins not with a touch, but with a look, and that, sometimes, the most sensual moments unfold fully clothed, beneath silks and shadows, where eyes do all the speaking. In a candle-lit cell, a nun runs her fingers over the edge of a worn letter. It has no signature, only a pressed violet between the folds, and the faint trace of ink where tears once fell. She closes her eyes and whispers the name she cannot say aloud. Not here. Not anymore. In the medieval world, desire was not always met with fulfillment. Often it lived at a distance, stretched across fields, between classes, behind vows, or beyond the reach of safety. And in that distance, it grew sharp, refined, almost holy. Separation was a fact of life. Men went to war, to crusade, to court. Women remained behind, raising children, tending fields, waiting by doors. Lovers were divided by oceans, mountains, and sometimes only a few hundred paces that propriety rendered uncrossable. Letters became lifelines. Though literacy was not widespread, among those who could write or could pay scribes, letters became vessels of emotion. Some were passionate, others restrained. Many were never sent, but they were written, folded, kissed, and carried like relics. In one surviving fragment from the 12th century, a woman writes to her absent husband, "My body aches for you, like the earth for rain. Every sound at the gate I hope is your step." In another, a knight tells his beloved, "I sleep beside your name." Such words mattered. They were touch in ink. But writing was not the only expression of longing. Some carved names into trees. Others sent small gifts, a scarf, a comb, a bit of lace. These tokens crossed rivers and borders, sometimes arriving years late, sometimes never at all. Class, too, imposed distance. A servant might adore her lord, a merchant's son dream of a noble daughter. These were not simply unrequited loves. They were impossibilities, yet they happened. In glances across dinner tables, in secret songs hummed while sweeping. In the poetry of silence, a peasant girl might see a knight pass once and think of him all winter. A monk might kneel beside a bishop and feel something too warm to be holy. These were not affairs, they were heartaches. Soft, enduring, invisible. Religion created its own walls. Those who took vows of chastity, monks, nuns, priests, were meant to give their love to God alone. But love, as it so often does, refused neat boundaries. A friar might long for the widow he once comforted. A nun might dream of her childhood friend. These feelings were rarely acted upon, but they were felt deeply, and often transmuted into prayer, into poetry, into guilt. War was perhaps the most brutal separator. Husbands conscripted, sons marched, lovers promised to return. And for those left behind, the days bled into each, other like candle wax. Some waited faithfully. Others found comfort in new arms. Many did both, torn between memory and survival. Sexual fidelity in such contexts was complicated. The church preached loyalty, communities expected restraint, but the heart and the body hungered for warmth. A soldier's wife might lie alone for years. A young man might return to find his sweetheart married to another. Desire did not pause for duty. It found detours. Yet the longing itself held power. In some ways, it made love more precious. A kiss anticipated for months felt different. A touch remembered could last a lifetime. Distance sharpened emotion into something crystalline, fragile, beautiful, painful. Folk songs captured this ache. Ballads told of lovers separated by seas, by curses, by family feuds. The refrain was always the same. I am yours, though I cannot reach you. These songs were sung at harvests, at weddings, even funerals. Everyone knew the tune. Everyone had waited for someone. Even within marriage, emotional distance was common. Spouses betrothed young, or matched for politics, often lived parallel lives. And in those silences, other affections formed, some within the mind, some within the flesh. A woman might carry a torch for a friend's husband her entire life, never saying a word. A man might recall his first love each time he drinks alone. These inner landscapes were rich, and often more enduring than the relationships society blessed. Medieval literature, especially in the tradition of courtly love, exalted this kind of distant, unreachable longing. The beloved was usually unattainable, married, noble, divine. The lover suffered nobly, often silently, proving the depth of his devotion through restraint. It was not meant to be fulfilled. That was the point. Desire purified by distance. But what happens when distance breaks? Some reunions ended in joy. Lovers embraced after years apart. Children lifted into the arms of returning fathers. Promises made under moonlight finally fulfilled. But others found only disillusion. The letter had lied. The token meant nothing. The person they remembered no longer existed, still they had loved. And in a world where so much was fleeting, crops, safety, life itself, that mattered, to long was to hope. To hope was to believe in more than survival. So they continued, sending letters, holding dreams, speaking names into the night. They lived in that space between memory and maybe, between the candle and the door. And perhaps that is where love is most visible, not in its consummation, but in its endurance, in the ache that doesn't fade, in the quiet loyalty of waiting, in the way we hold on to what cannot hold us back. So, the next time we hear a song of a lover lost at sea, or read a poem about a lady glimpsed once from horseback, let us not roll our eyes at the drama. Let us remember, in the Middle Ages, longing was not weakness, it was survival. The snow had not yet melted, but already the square was filling with music. Drums echoed against stone walls. Ribbons fluttered from poles. A man in a jester's cap offered bread from a basket, laughing as he stumbled, deliberately, into the arms of a blushing girl. Somewhere a priest looked the other way. It was carnival, and for a few blessed days, rules no longer ruled. In the rigid order of medieval life, where class, gender, and morality governed every hour, there were moments of sanctioned chaos. Moments when the world turned upside down, when the fool became king, when the maiden became the hunter, when desire, usually confined to shadows and silence, stepped briefly into daylight. Festivals were not simply entertainment. They were pressure valves, ways for societies built on obedience to release, play, and imagine. And at the heart of many of these celebrations pulsed something unmistakably human: longing. Consider May Day. On the 1st of May, villagers gathered before sunrise to go a-maying, a euphemism that veiled more than one kind of awakening. Young men and women disappeared into the woods together, returning hours later with flowers in their hair and often stories in their eyes. Parents looked the other way. Elders smiled knowingly. Some communities even held mock weddings, allowing temporary pairings that were half joke, half hope. The church attempted to Christianize these festivals, overlaying saints' days atop pagan rites, but the body remembered older rhythms. Beltane fires, maypoles, fertility dances. They carried echoes of ancient celebrations where sex was not sin but seed, where pleasure promised harvest. Carnival, held before Lent, was another invitation to indulge. For days or even weeks, towns erupted into masks, food, drink, and masquerade. People wore disguises not just to hide, but to reveal. A noble might don a beggar's rags. A monk might dress as a devil. A woman might play a man. These inversions thrilled and unsettled, because beneath the satire lay something truer than pretense. In these disguises, desire found new freedom. A man might flirt with someone he would never approach in daylight. A widow might dance with a knight. A servant girl might kiss a bishop's hand without punishment. And sometimes, these flirtations became more. Behind masks, choices widened. The eyes asked, not the name. For once, status bowed to sensation. Masks and mystery plays added to the energy. These performances often included risque jokes, satirical songs, and lewd pantomimes. Bodies were exaggerated, genders bent, morals mocked. And while officials tisked and theologians grumbled, the laughter always won. But not all festivals were so loud. In smaller villages, harvest celebrations held a quieter intimacy. Couples met in granaries or orchards. Offerings were made to bless fertility. Of land, yes, but also of womb. A woman might wear a crown of wheat to signal readiness for courtship. A man might carve a token from last year's tools. These symbols, rustic, humble, spoke more clearly than sermons. Even Christmas, a season of solemnity, held its moments. The Lord of Misrule, appointed to oversee festivities, brought chaos to court. He might command nobles to dance, bishops to sing bawdy ballads, or knights to serve wine. In the laughter of reversal, something radical shimmered, the possibility that rules were choices, not fate. These temporary freedoms had limits, of course. After the feast came the fast, after indulgence, penance. But even the return to order acknowledged what had been made visible, that people were not only minds and morals, they were flesh, and flesh remembers joy. Not everyone welcomed these expressions. Reformers saw festivals as threats, gateways to sin, drunkenness, and disorder. Laws were passed to curb dancing, to ban certain masks, to restrict night gatherings. But enforcement was uneven, because deep down, even those who wrote the laws felt the itch to laugh to loosen, to live. Women in particular found power in festivals. On normal days, they were expected to be modest, silent, obedient. But during celebrations, they could sing, mock, pursue. A milkmaid might crown herself queen of the feast. A nun might recite a poem full of double meanings. A mother of 5 might flirt like a girl again. These performances were not lies. They were extensions of truth rarely allowed to surface. For young people, festivals often marked firsts. The first dance, the first touch, the first glance held too long. The memories shaped them. Sometimes, a May Day tryst led to marriage. Sometimes, to heartbreak. Always, to a fuller sense of what it meant to be alive. And for the old, these days brought memory. An old man might watch the dancers and remember his first love's laughter. An aging widow might drink a little too much wine and sing the song she once sang at 17. In these moments, youth and age touched hands again. Even animals were not left out. In some towns, goats were crowned, cats paraded, bears led through streets with bells. It was absurd, but deeply symbolic. A way of saying, for now, the world is not what it was. Let us be creatures. Let us be free. Then, slowly, it ended. Masks came off. Roles were returned. Clothes were brushed clean. And people walked back to their places, changed, if only slightly. The echo of laughter still in their throats. The taste of someone's name on their lips. Because in those brief windows, the body had spoken. The soul had danced. And though nothing official may have happened, everything did. So let us remember, while the medieval world feared the body, it also celebrated it. Not always in scripture, but in song, in firelight, in ribbons tied to trees. And for a people told daily to suppress their hunger, these festivals were not just escape, they were reminders that desire, when allowed to breathe, does not destroy order. It renews it. The hearth is low, its embers glowing softly in the dusk. An old man reaches for his wife's hand, not urgently, not with the passion of youth, but with something steadier. Her skin is thin, her grip gentle, but their fingers still remember how to fit together. In a world that prized youth and bloom, their love is no longer loud, but it is deep, rooted, real. Medieval society, like many others, idolized youth. In songs, poems, and paintings, lovers were always young, fair, strong. Beauty was tied to fertility, strength to desire. Aging was often framed as decline of the body, of usefulness, of attraction, but that was only one story. Beyond the ballads and banners, people aged, and they didn't stop needing warmth, or connection, or closeness. Widowhood was common. Life expectancy was short by today's standards, but those who survived childhood often lived into their 50s or 60s, and beyond. Many remarried, some out of economic need, some for companionship, a few even for love. The church encouraged older widows and widowers to focus on piety and prayer, discouraging remarriage in favor of chastity. For women especially, continued sexual activity later in life was seen as undignified, even unnatural. A lusty widow became a stock character in morality plays, a warning, a joke, a scorned figure. But real life was quieter and kinder. Older couples who stayed together often found new rhythms. The urgency of youth faded, but affection deepened. With children grown, duties shifted. There was more time to talk, to walk, to sleep without interruption. A kiss was no longer a spark, it was a reminder. Sex in old age did not disappear, it simply changed. Many older men continued to feel desire, though medicine of the time often linked declining virility with melancholy or humoral imbalance. Remedies abounded: warm wine with cinnamon, aphrodisiac herbs, even animal parts believed, to restore vigor. Most didn't work, some did, but many men learned to express affection in other ways. For women, menopause was both a liberation and a loss. freed from the fear of pregnancy, some rediscovered desire, others mourned the fading of what had once made them feel wanted or powerful. And in both cases, intimacy could become less about sex and more about presence. A woman might sit beside her husband and comb his hair. A man might place his hand on his wife's back as she stirs the pot. A touch born of habit, but filled with meaning. These gestures were not grand, but they mattered. They were the quiet continuation of love. Friendship, too, often became intimacy. In villages and convents, older women lived together, sometimes by necessity, sometimes by choice. They shared beds for warmth, told stories in the dark, touched each other's hair with care. Whether we call these bonds romantic or not, they were deeply emotional. They filled a space that society rarely acknowledged, the longing not for sex, but for nearness. Some found love late. A widower and a widow, neighbours for years, might begin to walk together after Vespers. A former nurse and her aging employer might discover affection that was never spoken while roles constrained them. These were not stories sung by minstrels, but they were real, and they were tender. Literature occasionally acknowledged this quiet, late love. In Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, the wife of Bath speaks frankly about her 5 husbands, her aging body, her desire, not always with grace, but with defiance. She insists that age does not erase appetite, that wisdom does not preclude want. In some folk tales, old lovers are reunited after decades apart. The spark is no longer physical, but emotional, a recognition, a shared memory. A reminder that even when the body changes, the soul remembers. Physical challenges were acknowledged, ailments, arthritis, fatigue. But these were not always barriers. Instead, they shaped a slower kind of intimacy, one that prioritized touch over urgency, listening over conquest, laughter over performance. And there was healing in it. Older people often carried grief, partners lost, children buried, youth stolen by war or labor. To be touched again, gently, without demand, was to feel briefly restored, seen, still alive. In monasteries, aged monks sometimes wrote poems not of God alone, but of memory. One Benedictine scribe, in his 80s, wrote of a hand he once held in spring. "The world was not kinder then," he wrote, "but my bones were warmer, and her name came easier to my mouth." It was not lust, it was love, softened by time. Even those who had never married, or who lived celibate lives, did not abandon the longing for closeness. They found it in touch, in companionship, in shared stories, in sitting by a fire and watching shadows dance on the wall. What sex meant to them, if it existed at all, was not what it meant at 20. It was a comfort, a familiarity, a permission to let go. We often forget this part of the story, the idea that bodies, though weathered, still crave connection, that love does not retire, that desire is not owned by youth. But the medieval world, for all its constraints, knew it, quietly. In the way an old man carved his wife's name into the handle of his cane, in the way a widow wore her husband's shirt long after he passed, in the way 2 friends touched foreheads before parting, there was still fire, but it glowed now, instead of burned. So when we think of sex in the Middle Ages, let us remember this too. Not just the heat of new love, but the warmth that endures. The kind that holds your hand while the night grows cold. The kind that waits with you, even when no one else does. Because intimacy in the end is not measured in motion, but in meaning. The candles have burned low now. The hall is empty. The feast is over. The music has faded into memory and the tapestries hang still in the hush of midnight. If you lean in, you might hear it. The trace of laughter, the echo of a name once, whispered in a chapel, the rustle of a letter never sent. And somewhere, in that silence, is the truth. We were never so different from them. Across 20 chapters, we've wandered through bedchambers and brothels, gardens and graveyards, chapels and cottages. We've watched lovers meet and part. We've stood with widows and monks. We've listened to songs sung in secret and prayers whispered in fear. We've seen the fire of first touch and the quiet warmth of hands held through pain. So what, after all, was sex really like in the medieval world? It was holy and hidden, celebrated and shamed. It was rule-bound and rebellious. It was the site of pleasure and of punishment, of comfort and of control. It was never just one thing, never only about the act, always, at its core, about the longing to be known, to be chosen, to be close, and it lived in the smallest moments, in a girl adjusting her veil to catch a glance, in a boy carving initials into a tree, in a woman washing her lover's feet after a long day, in a man sewing a patch into his wife's cloak, just where her shoulder gets cold. It lived in the questions never asked aloud, in the dreams never told, in the aches that had no name, and yet were shared by all. For all the laws and liturgies, people still found their way to one another. They crossed boundaries with eyes, with poems, with hands beneath cloaks. They risked scandal for a night or a lifetime of truth. They made mistakes. They made families. They made stories. And some of those stories remain, written in court records and marginalia, in stained glass and lullabies, in the curve of a sculpture's hip, in the corners of old love letters tucked between the pages of saints' biographies, the sacred and the sensual, never fully separate. We tend to look back and simplify, to see the past as rigid, distant, unfamiliar. But if the Middle Ages were cloaked in mystery, they were also saturated with humanity. People then cried out in the same ways we do now, when touched too roughly, or not at all, when left waiting, when seen fully for the first time. Sex was shaped by power, yes, by gender, by class, by religion. But it also broke through those things, at least for a moment, at least in secret. It made unlikely people reach for one another, and in doing so, it revealed something eternal, that we are, at our core, made to connect. Some found that connection in the arms of a spouse, others in stolen meetings behind church walls. Some waited years for a single kiss. Others lived entire, lives without ever being touched the way they wanted, but still dreamed. The body was the beginning, but not the whole. There was also the mind, the spirit, the ache, the hope, the waiting. We saw it in the courtly lover who wrote songs for a woman he could never touch, in the nun who cried in prayer because her longing had no place to go, in the peasant girl who danced barefoot under the May moon, praying someone would follow. We saw it in the monk who spent years copying texts, but paused when writing the word beloved, in the widow who still laid out her husband's cloak each winter, in the old man who once a year returned to the field where he first touched her hand. These are not stories of saints. They are stories of us, not because we know their names, most we never will, but because their hearts beat like ours, because their nights were long like ours, because they too lay awake wondering if they were worthy of being loved. And isn't that what intimacy truly is? Not just the act, but the asking, the permission to be soft, the hope that someone will stay, the trust that even if we change, someone will still want to trace the map of our skin, not with judgment, but with care. Sex in the medieval world was not always romantic. It was not always kind. But within its tangled threads was woven something undeniable, the need to matter to someone else, not as a servant or a vessel or a sinner, but as a soul. And that need has not changed. So as we close this long journey, let us not walk away thinking only of customs or costumes, of rituals or rules. Let us remember the people behind them, the breath behind the curtain, the footstep on the stair, the pause before the yes, Let us remember that desire, however clothed in shame or song, is a form of memory, a reaching towards something that feels like home. And that love, in all its forms, was never just about passion. It was also about presence, a body beside you when the storm came, a voice in the dark, a hand that stayed. In the end, that's what remains. Not the rules, not the fear, but the touch.